Hey, and welcome back to another Q&A special, this time to mark passing 200,000 subscribers, which has happened just so quickly, so thank you so much to everyone who's chosen to follow along so far. I really did think that 200,000 would take a lot longer to hit, so these sequential Q&A style videos, which I was planning on doing every 100,000 subscribers, may need to happen a little less frequently. Anyhow, passing the 100,000 milestone meant that I received one of these YouTube plaques in the post, which feels incredibly surreal, as I've been watching YouTube probably for the last 10 years or so, especially pottery videos, when I was a teenager and just starting out on my ceramics education. So now I've come full circle, really, and hopefully the videos that I put online might inspire some to pursue this craft as their career, like it did me. Anyway, let's get started with this Q&A. As usual, I asked over on Instagram and on YouTube too for any questions you all might have about my craft or running a business or using social media to promote yourself or anything else really. So let's begin. Dust on the Sill asks, I would love to know more about your marketing and advertising strategies, any do's or don'ts or advice in that area. So it's probably worth mentioning that I've never used any paid advertising. I've never once promoted a post or a video on Instagram or any other social media platform. I'm not advocating against it. It's just something that luckily I've never needed to do. Building an organic audience might be difficult in the long term, but it results in having an audience that engages with your work and with your story and with your pots in a way that paying for advertising will never do. I know it's probably a boring thing to hear, especially if you've Googled and watched videos about how to build an audience. But being yourself and building a narrative that people can follow in combination with taking good photos and videos and other content really is the only strategy I've ever followed. And by observing other creators on other various platforms, it tends to be the same one they follow too. Now of course, I'm sure advertising can and does work. I think you just need to be really careful about how you do it in such a way that it doesn't come across as pushy or needy. Social media is in essence free advertising. My business was pretty much propped up and founded via posting on Instagram, and I'll continue answering this question along with this one, as it's without question the thing I'm asked the most. Pottery by Swathi asks, tips for Instagram success? And I think really this is something I should make a video specifically about in the future. But for now, let's just keep the answer simple. If your aim is to build a social media following, you need to understand that it really is a lot of hard work, unless of course you get very lucky. You just have to put in the hours, the time and effort, and I think this one point is so often just quickly gleaned over, in the same way that, say, if you want to gain muscle and become very fit, you need to put in the hours, be it working out regularly or going to the gym. It doesn't just happen overnight. If you want to be successful, you have to put in the time and effort. And the same thing goes for social media, as ultimately you need to give people a reason to follow you. So if you do just take poor photographs with bad lighting of the pots you're making, without any context or story behind it, don't be surprised if that doesn't make an impact. Of course, you can just get lucky, but I think some people fixate on that. I was once told a story by a family member of mine that one evening they were out at a dinner and the topic of my social media and pottery making came up in conversation, and the person was convinced that I had just got lucky. That's the reason I was able to build a big following online, not the fact that I was spending hours each evening creating videos and posts for various social media platforms, engaging with all the comments, networking, teaching myself how to film and take photographs, and also write a considerable amount with each post too. Just because you don't see the behind the scenes of what somebody's doing doesn't mean that their success is based purely on luck. Kyle Meets Clay asks, what kind of camera and lens do you use for your videos and photographs? Well, at the moment I'm using a Canon 5D Mark IV for pretty much all my filming and all my photography. As for lenses, there's really two main ones that I use. There's the one that this footage is filmed on, which is a Canon 100mm 2.8f macro lens, which might be overkill for filming in some instances, but it films lovely close-ups, and there's absolutely no distortion or sort of fish-eye lensiness which can happen with other kinds of lenses. And it's also wonderful for product shots, I think. If you do plan on filming yourself at work, it might not be the most practical, as my camera and tripod for filming this shot are really quite far away from the action, which means you need a space large enough so that you can easily move the camera and lens around and get the right angles. I do really want to upgrade this lens too. I'd love a 100mm lens with a much lower f-stop, so I can film more easily when the light isn't so good, as I always prefer filming with natural light. The other lens I use, which is arguably more practical, is a Sigma 50mm 1.2f art lens, which just provides wonderfully crisp images in film, although mine's in desperate need of repair, as it took the brunt of a fall when one of my ancient tripod's legs gave out recently. Thankfully there's no broken glass or anything, it still works, but it just rattles an awful lot. Anda Kazaku asks, are you planning on making different coloured glazes other than your usual signature greens? Yes, I certainly am. You may have seen on my Instagram lately a few videos showing me making some test tiles, hundreds of the things in both stoneware and porcelain. I have admittedly been using the same colour palette for a long time now, and whilst I still do very much enjoy them, I will now also be spending a lot of time trying to find something else, something different or new, or just an addition to add to these colours. That's something else to make a video about, that exploration, and the journey to finding something new. It can take a long time, but I do have some ideas. I suppose one of my fundamental issues with the glazes that I use currently is how thick they tend to be and how opaque they are too. I usually spend so much time making sure that the actual clay work of the pots I make is very delicate, it's finely finished. I really do take a lot of pride in the level of craftsmanship, but often those features that I really love are hidden underneath the layers of thick glaze. And it isn't always like that, but I think I also want to find a glaze which I can apply more thinly and spend less time cleaning up, as at the moment that's a huge time sink for me. Glazing the pots is one thing, but then spending all the time fettling the surfaces and making sure they're as pristine and perfect as possible can end up taking days and weeks, and I think I might finally be reaching some kind of limit. So yes, hopefully there'll be new glazes on the horizon. Cameron Hall asks, if you weren't doing pottery, what would you like to do for a living? So I'm going to exclude the art world for this, as I think that's probably inevitably where I would have ended up had it not been for pottery, be it a graphic designer or something. And there was even a small spell where I quite wanted to be a set designer. But if I exclude that world, I really do love the idea of working in the space industry, be it on rocket engines or some other kind of engineering job. It'll never happen, of course, but I vicariously live that life, be it by watching all manner of live rocket launches on YouTube, alongside creators such as Scott Manley, Everyday Astronaut, and NASA Spaceflight, to name a few. I suppose I'll just have to make do with my boring old gas kiln for now. Local Dog Petter asks, are there any other endeavours that you always wanted to pursue, but have taken a back burner for the time being? I suppose there are two ceramics-based answers to this. The first being the book, which I'm constantly putting off, is something that I've written a few random chapters for, together with dozens of pages of just random notes, be it from my education, my time during Japan, and my apprenticeship with Lisa Hammond. There's a story in there somewhere, but the one thing I don't want to do is make another pottery how-to book. There's a sea of those out there already, and I'm not going to improve on those. The other thing that's taken a back burner for a while, but is something that I'm finally getting around to, is working with porcelain again. I've made my glazed test tiles, and hopefully I'll get something promising during this next round of firings, which I'll then be able to use on a series of thrown porcelain pieces to accompany my usual stoneware range. Tio Leng Yen asks, when you are moulding the clay, what is going through your mind? Usually not a lot, is the answer, especially if I'm throwing large batches of identical pots. I try to get my mind focused on whatever it is I'm listening to, be it an audiobook or a podcast, or just some music. I prefer that state as compared to simply letting my mind wander, where I might be thinking about all manner of things. Time passes more quickly when I'm engrossed in a good book, and there's this sweet spot where you're so engaged with your hands physically, and mentally just being engaged with the story you're listening to, which I just really love. And it can help make the monotonous tasks, such as throwing hundreds of mugs or glazing hundreds of pots, just bearable, really. I do of course enjoy the repetition to some degree, but everybody has their limits. Which I suppose leads more into this question, Axgustin asks, do you ever get burned out from creating repetitive ceramic items and have to take a break from creating? How do you find variety in the commercial items you make? If it's items such as mugs or bowls, items which I make hundreds of as opposed to just dozens or fewer, I almost have a mindset where I see, say, 60 mugs that I've wedged all the clay for to throw in one sitting as one body of work. The pots are all the same to me, more or less, until they've been fired, and it's only once their layer of glaze has become molten and the pot set in stone that each takes on a more personal, individual character. So as I'm making the pots, sometimes it really doesn't feel as if I'm producing that many, and in the grand scheme of things, I'm really not. Every year I make probably 500 to 600 mugs, and I'm a quick maker after all, which does help. I suppose the biggest driving factor though is the fact that I know there are people out there who want my pots and who want to support my business. And that isn't to say that I feel an obligation to make work for everybody, and I would like to give those people who have supported me a chance to purchase my pottery, which means making a lot of pots. But I think I have more or less reached my limit, especially with the addition of creating YouTube videos added into my schedule. The only way I could make more pots at this point would be if I were to hire staff and really scale up my business, which, to be honest, isn't something I want to do. Ocean Raku asks, I'm curious about what potters inspired you and who you look up to. Now, this is an answer that really has changed a lot over time. The potters who inspired me at the beginning are very different from those who inspire me nowadays. At the beginning, when I was 17 or so, and only just really starting to learn about the pottery world, I was very much inspired by mostly just studio potters from Britain, be it Bernard Leach, Lisa Hammond, Mike Dodd, Phil Rogers, and numerous other makers of a similar calibre. And slowly that's changed over time, as I've travelled, as I've met hundreds of other potters, and been exposed to all manner of other types of work. So I'll give you a more contemporary list. I really love the work of Rupert Spira, James and Tilla Waters, Jajan Lee, who I exhibited alongside with fairly recently. Then there's the Danish potter Anameta Yotsoi, whose coffee cup I've probably used every morning for the last 5 years. There's Takeshi Endo, who makes just completely amazing minimal pottery, and Shikamaru Takeshita, who held an exhibition the same time I was in Mashko, whose work is just completely sublime. It's wood-fired, yet it's so incredibly simple. I love it. And then there's the teaware master Wu Wei Cheng, and lately I've been really liking the work of Diko Kim and Inwa Lee, but probably my most favourite maker that I've come across lately, who isn't even a potter, but a metal worker, called Jiro Nagase. Sorry that's such a long list. I'll leave a link to each of these people in the description below. Brittany Taylor asks, would you, or have you ever considered or done custom pottery orders? I have done in the past a few custom orders, but I have never created my own pots to somebody else's design, to their specific shape or with a certain glaze or a name painted over it. There have been opportunities that have come along that have offered the potential to create some very interesting custom work, be it restaurant commissions, pots for hotels and banks, pieces to appear in movies, and all manner of things. But in 95% of cases I'd probably turn them down. I am, in reality, in a very fortunate position to be able to do that. But I suppose ultimately I want to create the pots that I want to create. I've managed to build a business model where I can sit down in the morning and go, today I want to make teapots, or bowls, or ink-tip pens. I don't make pots according to lists or orders. I simply create what I want to, and I suppose I'm very lucky over time to have built up an audience that's willing to purchase that work. All that being said, if there were a certain project or custom order that were to come along that was particularly interesting and unique, of course I'd do it, but I'm not interested in making the pots I do and just sticking somebody's initials on the side. Curious Kate asks, who are some of your inspirations? What is your favourite thing to make? And how often do you deep clean your studio? Now, I've answered the first one of those, but as for shape, I think it will, and probably might always be, just a simple bowl, or at least that's my current favourite. The throwing of them is simple, and it often contrasts the way I throw many of my other forms, which are thrown as thin, narrow cylinders, where you're constantly fighting centrifugal force to keep the pot as constrained into the middle of the wheel as possible. Whereas with bowls, I'm simply allowing the clay to flow outward to follow centrifugal force, and all my focus is just on that internal curve of the bowl. But not only that, it also means I get to trim them, which is by far probably my favourite process. And as for how often do I deep clean my studio, well, let's talk about that. I think there's often a sort of presumption from people who view my Instagram and follow me that I'm a clean freak and I keep everything spotless and constantly tidy. I'd say nowadays that really isn't the case. All I do is I clean often, but only a little bit. I find it quite easy to keep my workspace clean, so a really thorough deep clean probably only happens once every 4 or 5 months, which usually coincides with when I do a shop update, as I like to clean the studio really thoroughly before I bring all my boxes and packaging materials down from the mezzanine into the studio. That way they don't get covered in clay dust or glaze. Now, all that being said, I would probably say I do care about the cleanliness of a studio, perhaps more than other potters might. And really I'd say that's down to my training, or more specifically my apprenticeship with Lisa Hammond. Keeping the studio clean is mostly up to the apprentice. There were evening classes held 4 nights a week when I was there, and one of my tasks when I came in the morning was doing a big cleanup from the night before, and I simply couldn't focus on making any pottery until I'd cleaned the studio. When the space was clean and tidy, relatively, I felt as if I had a clear mind, and only thereafter could I make happily. Which is interesting, as this same sort of practice was echoed during my 6 months in Japan. Every morning, at 8 o'clock sharp, myself and Ken Matsuzaki's main apprentice, who was called Doi, would spend a couple of hours sweeping the entire grounds of leaves. My apprenticeship there was over the autumn and winter, so this was pretty much a constant during my time in Japan. We'd pack in all the fallen leaves into the wood kiln and burn them, and then when it started to snow regularly, the morning task changed to shoveling, clearing all the driveways, the walkways, and the road. And again, it sort of felt as if it cleaned my mind and got me ready for the day ahead. And often I tell people these stories, and they think it's unfair and too much hard work. And actually, I don't think about it like that whatsoever. In fact, they are some of my most fond memories. In the crisp morning, in the golden light, shoveling leaves and snow, in what was usually silence. I miss that sometimes. Bob Dinetz asks, do you ever find yourself altering a method of making so it will be more appealing as a photograph or video content? For the actual making process, I wouldn't say so. The only difference, perhaps, is that I've purposely left space all the way around my wheel so that I can move my camera and tripod all the way around to make filming all those different angles more easy. As for photographs, I do perhaps sometimes position wearboards with pots on in certain ways so that the light hits them better, but nowadays that's more or less just totally ingrained in the way I do things. I barely even think about it. Occasionally I'll notice, when setting up a certain frame, that there's clutter in the background or something like that, or an object that has a particularly bright colour that pops out and can ruin the rest of the scene. In those instances, I will remove those objects or place a board over them to hide them. But that's more or less the extent of it, I think. I do have one messy corner in my studio, but I simply throw a tarpaulin over it to hide everything. SunSunX asks, do you spend most of your time doing pottery? How long have you been doing that? And do you think you'll do it for the rest of your life? And the answers for these are simple, really. I do indeed spend most of my time doing pottery in some way, shape or form. If I'm not in the studio making pottery, I'll be at home editing videos and creating content for my YouTube channel or my Instagram. As for how long I've been doing this, I started making pots when I was about 16 or 17, and I'm just about to turn 29 years old. And lastly, will I be doing it for the rest of my life? Well, that's difficult to answer, really. I'd like to think I would. I think potters tend to work right up until they die, in many instances, from what I've seen over the years, or there's a certain point where they retire. And I think this is an interesting topic, really. As in a potter's life, I imagine technically you probably reach your prime, technically, at about 45 to 60 years old. That's a really rough estimate, of course, but fundamentally it's a craft that is very physical, and there will come a point where your pots begin to get worse, after decades of them reaching a certain apex. So I suppose it's a question whether you just keep on making and potting after this point, right into your old age, where others' assumptions might be something along the lines of, oh wow, look how well he's doing, he's still managing to make pots. So I don't know whether it's better to retire at a certain point, or just continue doing what you love until you physically can't, which is certainly the more romantic answer, and I have no idea yet what I'll be doing. The Sad Life of Jeff asks, what is the nail care routine, Florian? And blimey, I have no idea. I just cut them when they get long and try my very best not to injure any of my fingertips. Apart from that, I pretty much don't do anything. My hands do of course get quite dry, and I don't use nearly enough hand moisturiser as I should. And really, when I'm throwing, it's actually not so bad. It's really the weeks that I spend glazing pots that really wears them out. Anyway, my answer would be really that I'm not the potter to ask for advice on nail care. Sorry. Samuel Harley asks, do you see a career in the arts similar to yours is harder now that social media platforms are changing so rapidly? Even Instagram has said that they are no longer a photo sharing platform, which worries smaller creators trying to gain traction. I wouldn't say it's harder, you've just got to be willing to adapt. I think back in the day before social media, it really was very difficult sometimes to get your name out there, and if you weren't associated with a gallery that helped push your work, it could be incredibly difficult to gain traction. I've heard stories of potters who would literally just load their car up with pots and then spend time driving around the country, going from galleries to shops, and each time pitching themselves and asking if that shop or gallery would sell their work, which just isn't something you need to do nowadays, as practically all your advertising and networking can, to some degree, be done online. And now, if we come back to the present and we look at your question, which was, do you think it's harder now that social media platforms are changing so rapidly? Now, to some degree, if you aren't keeping up with the times on social media, say you aren't trying out new features such as IGTV or Reels or using TikTok, or just creating video content in general, you are putting yourself at a significant disadvantage compared to those who are. But as long as you're willing to engage with these new features, which might mean working harder, such as producing more content, creating videos and all of that, then there's no reason that smaller creators would find it harder to gain traction. I've seen numerous really small accounts explode since the introduction of Reels, and there are still small makers who still do really well just with photographic content. If it's of a high enough quality, or if it's telling a compelling story, then there's no reason that it shouldn't be successful. But you still may find it difficult to compete with people who are producing videos, be it Reels or IGTV. And that makes a lot of sense, because if you think about Instagram, for instance, you can create content that's a post, be it a video or a photograph, a story, an IGTV video, a reel, you can go live, and you can even create guides. So that's 6 ways of creating content on one app, and it's within Instagram's best interests to share content from all 6 of these. So if you are only creating content in one of these categories, then your content will only be seen by 1/6 of the audience, potentially, of course. So if you do want Instagram to be more successful for you, you really do need to engage with as many of these features as possible. But I don't think Instagram saying that it's no longer a photo sharing platform means that it'll be harder for smaller accounts to gain traction. The truth is, if you want to play the game, which is building empires on social media, then you need to be prepared to try out and use as many features as possible, especially new ones. Clooney Fretton asks, I'd be interested to hear how you manage a healthy work-life balance. It's so easy to get sucked into working all the time when you're self-employed, and I imagine it must be even more challenging when so much of your business derives from having to produce online content in addition to your studio work. How do you find time to relax? Truthfully, I don't have the best work-life balance. This narration I'm currently recording is being done at 8:30 PM. when I should definitely not be working. I have an absurd self-imposed rule where I have to post an Instagram every day, and then every other day I post a reel, and then on weekends I post a YouTube video. This isn't a specific guide I follow or a special schedule. is just something I've fallen into. And honestly, I don't think it's really that sustainable, but we'll see how it goes. I try, and I'm trying to figure out a better solution so that I'm not spending all my time working, as the line can get so easily blurred when you're self-employed, like you mentioned. For instance, does replying to comments at 2 in the morning count as work, or as soon as I wake up? And should I be doing that? Probably not, but it's so easy to do these days, and I'm constantly connected to a vast audience of people, so switching off from that can be incredibly difficult. Not to mention the endless stream of emails I receive or private messages. Ultimately, I think I'll reach a point where I either need to hire a PA or I need to take a step back in some way. One interesting way to look at it is people often leave their established careers to begin a career making YouTube videos. It's actually quite rare, I think, that you find people who have a full-time job and produce videos like this on a weekly basis, from what I've seen over the years at least. So yeah, I think a good, healthy work-life balance is really hard to achieve, and I certainly haven't figured out the perfect way of doing it yet. In fact, I'm probably a long way off that. And let's end it with a simple one. Deborah Gates asks, I'd love what a day in the life looks like, starting times, meals, and how you end your days in the studio. I tend to get into my studio at about 9 AM. I always have coffee at home, so I tend to begin straight away once I arrive. So after commuting about 30 minutes on the tube, out to my studio in High Barnet, I then walk up to my studio, which takes about 20 minutes. When I begin working, I put my phone on a shelf as not to be distracted, and I really try to only look at it at lunchtime, and then once I leave at about 5 or 6 o'clock. Throughout the day I work as normal, and I have my camera and tripod set up most of the time in my studio ready to film at any moment, and I have a very useful bull grip on my camera, which allows me to adjust and change the camera angle in seconds. Anything really to make this process as streamlined and as quick as possible, so that it doesn't hinder my making too much. As for meals, there's nothing special. I don't really take much of a lunch break. I just wolf down a sandwich and get back to work, which seems to be the story of my life. Once work's finished at the studio, I head home, and I usually spend about an hour or two editing photographs and reels and writing Instagram posts, and try to make a dent by replying to some of the never-ending emails. And finally, I think, Jax TYXD asks, is it possible to give more of a tour of your drawings and sketches? The whole reason I started to make hand-thrown ink dip pens is because draftsmanship used to be, and still is to some degree, a huge part of my process when making. Drawing pottery was always something that all my teachers growing up were very adamant I do, and ever since then it's something I try to do regularly, although since starting my studio and making pots so actively, I find myself having little time for it these days. You may have seen in some of my more recent videos the inclusion of more cross-sections and illustrations to further help explain what it is I'm speaking about. I always found it helpful to draw pots like this, to inform my own making, and I hope to do more of this too in future videos. I thought this one would be fun to include, which was one of my pages done in college when I was searching for a maker's mark. Initially, I went for the mark, second row down, third from the left, but ultimately I ended up not using any of these and landed on something far more simple instead. I'd be interested in hearing which ones you like, as I never know if I made the right decision. It's difficult to come up with a mark which is unique and, for my taste, one that's not too complex, as I wanted my maker's mark to be a small symbol on the pot. If it contained too many lines and marks, it can easily be lost within the clay and glaze, and therefore can be difficult to read and identify. I have pages and pages worth of cross-sections like these, mostly done during my time in college and thereafter, so they don't necessarily reflect the style of pots I make nowadays, but I think if you do look hard enough, you will find some similarities. Anyhow, I think this video is getting long enough. Thanks so much for watching, if you've made it this far, and to all of those who've subscribed so far. To already almost reaching 250,000 subscribers in under a year is just unbelievable. So thank you, and I'll see you next week.